Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is my office. We're not often in here, but today we are. We are not often in here. I am, but welcome. Glad to have you with us. Today we are studying Alma, chapter 43 through 52. And these chapters are quite often known as the war chapters, but maybe today we can dig in and find something a little new, something that might bring some new light to these chapters. A lot of people have said, well, Mormon, who is compiling this record, is really a warrior, and so he really likes these war chapters and is putting them in for us. That might be true. Others might say, well, the war chapters will really help us fight the battles against the enemy here in the latter days. That's true too. I don't know all the reasons why the Lord had Mormon put the war chapters in the Book of Mormon, but I do think there are some great lessons for us to learn from all of these. The first thing is to reflect on the title page of the Book of Mormon and the purpose of the Book of Mormon. This will help us see insights into the war chapters, maybe in a different light. In the title page of the Book of Mormon, it is talking in the second paragraph about that this is to show unto the remnant of the house of Israel what great things the Lord hath done for their fathers, and that they may know the covenants of the Lord, and that they are not cast off forever. And also to the convincing of the Jew and Gentile that Jesus is the Christ, the eternal God, manifesting himself unto all nations. So the purpose of the Book of Mormon is about covenants. It's about Jesus Christ. It's about us being able to know our covenants and live our covenants so we are not cast off forever. So may I suggest that the war chapters of the Book of Mormon are about covenant keeping, are about protecting freedoms that allow me and you and all of us to take on covenants, live covenants, and be able to have that covenant relationship with our Father in heaven that President Nelson has so often spoken of. So let's not forget that purpose of the Book of Mormon as we look at the war chapters today. As a little bit of review, because there's a number of different names that are mentioned here in these war chapters. Okay, so I wrote them down, trying to kind of help us get a glimpse of all of these different adversaries that will come against the people of God. Okay, so in chapter 43 and 44, we have Zarahemnah. Now he's a Lamanite, and he's going to stir up the Amalekites and the Zoramites to go to battle against the Nephites, and he will have a little bit of success. And then we have Moroni, of course, who is a covenant keeper, and he is a Nephite. Then in chapter 45, we have pride that is creeping into the church. And here we have Amalickiah, who is a Nephite, but he wants to be king. And if he can't be king over the Nephites, he's going to go over to the Lamanites and try to be king over the Lamanites. And that's what he'll eventually do. So in chapter 47, he actually poisons the captain or the leader of the Lamanite army, Lahontai. And then we see that Amalickiah kills the king and marries the queen. We'll talk more about that. In chapter 48 and 49, Amalickiah is the one that's going to start the battles against Moroni and the Nephites. And then in chapter 50, we have another Nephite in the Nephite lands. They're in Zarahemnah's area, and his name is Morianton. He's going to have a problem with a land or property issue, and he's going to want to flee. And anyway, he stirs up some things as well. He's going to beat his maid. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then we have Teancum coming on the scene, who, if I'm just being personal with you, I think the Lord's saving Teancum for me. I'm just being silly there, but I love Teancum. I think he is such a great warrior, and I just am fascinated by him. So yeah, he's my future husband. Just kidding, but maybe not. Who knows? Anyway, then in chapter 51, we have the kingmen who are also Nephites. They are going to rise up in rebellion because they want a king again. They want power and authority, and they want to be the king and overthrow the reign of the judges. And then Moroni is going to have to put an end to that. Now, Amalickiah with the Lamanite armies are still coming to battle. Teancum will eventually kill him with a javelin. And then we have in chapter 52, Ammoron, who is Amalickiah's brother. He is going to be vengeful and want to come in and take over the cause of Amalickiah and takes charge of the Lamanite armies. Then we also have Jacob, who is a Zoramite, and he's a leader of one of the Lamanite armies. Remember, Amalickiah chooses Zoramites and Amulonites and now I can't remember the other. Anyway, there's a couple of insurrections where different groups of people fall away from the Nephites, and Amalickiah is going to use them because of their hatred towards the Nephites, even though they are originally Nephites, to put in as leaders of the armies because it preserves the hatred that Amalickiah wants the Lamanites to continue to have for the Nephites. And then Jacob will be killed in battle, and that's one of the chapters where Moroni is actually wounded. So it's interesting that we have all these different people coming up to battle, and the majority of them are Nephites. Nephites fighting Nephites. Nephites who have dissented and decided to fight against the Nephites again. We only have a couple. Zarahemna is one of them, who is a Lamanite. He's the first one that we have that comes up to war, but then we'll see he makes a covenant not to come up to war, and he doesn't anymore. So it's interesting that the battles that we're facing here, the majority of them come from people who originally had the covenant or who had been offered the covenant of God, and who went a different direction. And now they are persecuting or coming to war or having this hatred towards those that are covenant keeping. So that's an interesting kind of theme that runs through these chapters. So let's start in and look at some of these different people that we can learn about, and different things that we can also learn about the adversary and the way that the adversary works against us. So let's start in chapter 43. Okay. Oh, I forgot. As you go through these chapters, I would encourage you to look at the word covenant or oath and how often that is used throughout these chapters. And it's interesting how often enemies will offer each other a covenant. How often do we see Moroni offering a covenant to somebody else, saying, if you will no longer come up to war against us, we'll let you go in peace. And sometimes they take that covenant and they end up living amongst the Nephites. The Nephites even then protecting them because they have made covenants not to take up arms. So how does that happen? How do we as covenant keepers, how can we understand covenants better like they do here in the Book of Mormon? How do we understand better that when we don't keep our covenants, we are cast off? How do we understand better that protecting liberties allow us to have those covenants that we want to live so that we can eventually be back with our Father in heaven? Let me just share my screen for a second. I wanted us to reflect on one of those stories, I guess. Okay, hang on. One of those themes that I'm speaking of. Okay, let me share this screen with you just for a second. I made it red because I thought that was kind of appropriate for this time frame when so many people lose their lives. And I First of all, I do want to just mention that I'm very appreciative of men and women and their families who sacrifice so much to preserve liberties and freedoms so that I can participate in covenants, so that I can choose to live covenants and have those in my life. And my brother-in-law, my dad served, my brother-in-law serves, and I'm just grateful for the men and women and their families. And I have a fascination with particularly the World War II era. So here I am with a bunch of my friends. We were doing a military reenactment of the Battle of the Bulge, and I am in a World War II half track in a Panzer uniform. I don't have my helmet on though, but I'm up there by the big machine gun. Yeah, you're seeing me in a whole different light, aren't you? Okay, here's another picture. I am sitting in an actual German tank, Sherman tank, not German. Okay, so I had the opportunity to go and visit a collector's private museum of all of these old military vehicles, and he let me sit in this one. And then I also got to be in a parade where I helped to drive this tank down. Which road was it? Gilbert Road in Arizona. And I lived right there in Gilbert too. But I thought that was, you guys might be seeing me in a completely different light now. Yeah, I do love military stuff. Okay, off of me, back to Captain Moroni and covenants. So I want you to look at this picture for just a second. Since the title of liberty and Captain Moroni is so central to all that we discuss when we talk about the war chapters. But I appreciate the way that Arnold Freeberg has painted this. If you look at it carefully, you've got Captain Moroni, and he has his coat that he has written on, and it is on the pole that he has established. And I often like to ponder about what kind of conversations these men would have with their wives. So Captain Moroni is married because on the title of liberty, you can see that he writes, our wives, our children. So you know that he has this family. And so he goes home. We're just imagining. He goes home and he has a conversation with his wife. And his wife looks at this coat that he has rent and written upon. And she's like, honey, why rip your coat? Wasn't there something else you could have written on? I don't know what their discussion was, but that kind of makes me laugh. I think about that. Like, why rending a coat? That's significant here. There's something about the rending of the coat that is playing into what Captain Moroni is trying to express. So now look at the base of what Captain Moroni is standing on. You may or may not have noticed this before. So you've got those spears pointing up at him. And again, you could imagine it a couple of different ways. Are these spears of people who don't want to join the title of liberty? And because there were some who refused to take up the title of liberty. Or are these the picture of those saying, we want to be a part of this. We want to take this covenant as well. Because don't let that escape you. This is a covenant. So let's go ahead and start in chapter 46. I was going to start back in chapter 43, but let's start in chapter 46. Okay. So in chapter 46, we do have Amalickiah who is coming against Moroni and the people. Now we're in verse 10. Amalickiah, because he was a man of cutting device and a man of many flattering words, that he led away the hearts of many people to do wickedly, yea, and to seek to destroy the church of God, that organization that has the ability to issue the covenant, and to destroy the foundation of liberty, which God had granted unto them, or which blessing God had sent upon the face of the land for the righteous sake. And now it came to pass that when Moroni, who was chief commander of the armies of the Nephites, had heard of these dissensions, he was angry with Amalickiah. And it came to pass that he rent his coat. So that's the word. They don't use the word tear. They don't use the word cut. And he chooses to rent his coat. And there's a lot of, we could take it back to Old Testament and think about what that means historically with covenant keeping people. But Moroni is actually going to describe to us why he is rending his coat. Then he writes upon it, in our memory of our God, our religion, our freedom, our peace, our wives, our children, and he fastened upon the end of the pole. So he is rending this, and we will see that word rent in a number of different places in this chapter. So then he fastens it upon a pole, and he's going to bow down and pray in chapter 46, verse 13. He bowed himself to the earth, and he prayed mightily unto his God for the blessings of liberty to rest upon his brethren, so long as there should be a band of Christians remaining to possess the land. So he needs that liberty. He understands that that liberty is crucial to people, to the band of Christians, or the cause of Christians, as they'll talk about in these chapters, so that they can make and keep covenants with God. Okay. And in verse 15, it says, and those who did belong to the church were faithful. Yea, all those who were true believers in Christ took upon them gladly the name of Christ. So we're talking covenant language here. And Christians, as they were called, because of their belief in Christ who should come. So this isn't just about people who wanted to have faith in Christ or who loved Christ. This is a group of people who want the freedom to make and keep covenants with God. And then if you look at verse, let's see, 19, it mentions this again. He is waving this rent part of his garment in the air. Garment is another kind of covenant bit of language. And then verse 20, he said, whoever will maintain, let them come forth in the strength of the Lord. And here's where he actually uses the word covenant, and enter into a covenant that they will maintain their rights and their religion, that the Lord God may bless them. And then in verse 21, it uses the word covenant again. But look at what the people are doing. This is what we're seeing at the bottom of the picture there that I have on the screen. The people came running together with their armor girt about their loins, rending their garments in token, or as a covenant. Those are very covenant temple-esque words. Garment, rending, token, covenant. So we are talking about the covenant God gives to his children so that they might have eternal life, and that these people want liberty in their land, religious freedom in their land, so they can make and keep these covenants. Verse 21 continues, that they would not forsake the Lord their God, or in other words, that if they should transgress the commandments of God or fall into transgression and be ashamed to take upon them the name of Christ, that the Lord should rend them even as they had rent their garments. So what's at the feet of Captain Moroni here? All of those garments. They come forth rending their garments to say, we will make this covenant. And if we don't, what did it say? That the Lord should rend them even as they had rent their garments. That the Lord could cut them off, cast them out. What did our title page say? That the covenants of God are there to help us know that we are not cast off forever. The covenants of God are there to help us be sealed up unto him. So this group of people are seeing the liberties in their land, providing them the opportunities to live their covenants. And that's what they want for themselves, their wives, their children. And then in verse 22, it goes on with the word covenant. So they're making a covenant by doing this with their garment. And then it also reiterates what they were just saying in the middle of 22. If we shall fall into transgression, yea, he may cast us at the feet of our enemies, even as we have cast our garments at thy feet, to be trodden under foot, if we shall fall into transgression. Now, here's the interesting part. We quite often stop and talk about the title of liberty with all of that. And that's great. but we miss this next part. Quite often we don't join it to the next part of the writing in the scriptures, because this next part dives into Joseph, who was sold into Egypt. That's interesting. So Joseph, who was sold into Egypt, is going to be the next part of chapter 46. And again, we are talking about something that was rent. And we're talking about covenant, because you have Abraham, who had his son Isaac, who then had his son Jacob, who is Israel, and the 12 tribes. And God has made his covenant through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's even spoken of in the temple that way. It's spoken of in the Doctrine and Covenants. It's spoken of all through the Book of Mormon, that we make covenants with the God of Jacob, or the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So this next section is about Jacob and his son Joseph, who was sold into Egypt. So in verse 23, Moroni said unto them, behold, we are a remnant of the seed of Jacob. We are a remnant of the seed of Jacob, whose coat was rent by his brethren into many pieces. So think about again, who are coming against the Nephites? It's their brethren. It's people who used to be their brethren. They're with the Nephite population. Yes, they're inciting the Lamanites to come up to war against them, but it's really being led by their brethren. So Moroni goes on and says, whose coat was rent by his brethren into many pieces. And now behold, let us remember to keep the commandments of God, or our garments shall be rent by our brethren, and we be cast into prison, or be sold, or be slain. Isn't that interesting? Yea, let us preserve our liberty as a remnant of Joseph. Yea, let us remember the words of Jacob before his death. For behold, he saw that a part of that remnant of the coat of Joseph was preserved and had not decayed. And he said, even as this remnant of garment of my son hath been preserved, so shall a remnant of the seed of my son be preserved into the hands of God, and be taken unto himself, while the remainder of the seed of Joseph shall perish, even as the remnant of his garment. So go back to Old Testament times. We're thinking about this with Jacob, who hears about his son Joseph. Now, he had given a garment to his son Joseph that definitely represented covenant, power and authority, priesthood. And of course, the brothers were all angry. There was this upset. They then throw Joseph in a pit. They decide they want to kill him. And then they decide, nope, we're just going to sell him to the Midianites, who are going to take him into Egypt. And then they take the garment and they rip it and they dip it in blood and they take it back to their father. And their father looks at this. Now, Jacob had been promised, just like Abraham, just like Isaac, Jacob has been promised that his seed will be as the sands of the sea, that his priesthood will remain, that his family will bless the nations of the earth. It is the Abrahamic covenant, or the new and everlasting covenant. And this garment was a symbol of that, a token of that. And so as Jacob gets this bloody garment given back to him by his sons, and he believes Joseph to be dead, he still is remembering the covenant. Or as President Nelson would say, he's thinking celestial. And he says to himself, just like Abraham did when Abraham needed to sacrifice his son Isaac, Jacob is saying to himself, I don't know how God is going to preserve this remnant, but he promised me that a remnant of Joseph would go forth. And now my son is dead. And I don't know how that's going to happen, but I know God, and God doesn't say something that he's not going to fulfill. And so he holds on to that garment. That garment was preserved. That garment that they had taken back as evidence of Joseph dying, then eventually becomes this garment that Jacob realizes Joseph hadn't passed away. He had been taken into Egypt. He is now able to save his family. But wow, the faith of Jacob to be able to hold fast to covenants the Lord had made with him, even at the thought that his son is dead. And I appreciate the faith of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They all seem to have those kinds of experiences and yet hold fast to God's promises. So, this is just so powerful to me to know that Moroni is trying to help the people remember the covenant God has made. And then in verse 27, he says, and now who knoweth but what the remnant of the seed of Joseph, which shall perish as his garment, are those who have dissented from us. Yea, and even it shall be ourselves, if we do not stand fast in the faith of Christ. And so he gathers together all who will come and maintain liberty, all who will come to maintain religious freedom so that people can make and keep covenants. That's just such a powerful thing. And then he hoists the title of liberty up on the towers, and people rally around it. And he will use this often to help people remember this is what we're fighting for. We're fighting for the covenant with God, that special covenant relationship that President Emily Bell Freeman has spoken about, that Sister Annette Dennis has spoken about, that President Nelson has spoken about. We want to be able to have that freedom, to have that covenant relationship with God. So all through these chapters, covenant is a huge part of that. So now going back to Zarahemnah, because I think this is interesting. In chapter 43, so Zarahemnah comes against them, and look at the designs of Zarahemnah, which to me are kind of the designs. It kind of tells us what the designs of the adversary are. So this is chapter 43. Look at verse, let's see. Oh, verse 6 is a good one. So Zarahemnah appoints chief captains over the Lamanites that were Amalekites or Zoramites. And then verse 7 says, so he can preserve hatred towards the Nephites. But then in verse 8, we want to compare verse 8 and verse 9 because it talks about the designs of the enemy and the designs of Moroni and his people. So verse 8 says, Zarahemnah's designs were to stir up the Lamanites to anger against the Nephites, that he might usurp great power over them and gain power over the Nephites by bringing them into bondage. Doesn't that sound like what the adversary does? Stirs up anger, wants power over them, power to bring them into bondage. Okay, just like 2nd Nephi, where it says you can choose liberty and eternal life through the great mediator of all men, or you can choose captivity and death. You can be sealed up or you can be cast out. Those are the options. And then verse 9, this is the other design of the Nephites. Now the design of the Nephites was to support their lands and their houses and their wives and their children, that they might preserve them from the hands of their enemy, and also that they might preserve their rights and their privileges, yea, and also their liberty, that they might worship God according to their desires. Worship for us involves covenants, whether at church or in the temple, whether at home, wherever we are, it involves covenants. So those two are the main designs of either the enemy or those of God. And then Zarahemnah goes to battle, and Moroni is captain, and he's only 25 years old at the time. And they have an extreme battle, and the Nephites are protected in this battle. Look at verse 18 and 19. We can see what they were protected with. They have things that they're armed with, right? But then in verse 19, they have breastplates and arm shields and shields to defend their head, and they were dressed with thick clothing. But then compare that to verse 20. Those of Zarahemnah's army, they were naked, save it were a skin which was girt about their loins. Okay. And so this is interesting. So that the Nephites prepared themselves for battle by covering themselves versus those that were following those of the enemy that were naked. And whenever I hear covering, when somebody has covered themselves, I think of the atonement of Jesus Christ, because the word atonement in Hebrew, the Hebrew verb for the English word atonement actually means to cover. So I like to think about how when these people wanted protection, they covered themselves. And in the temple, we go and we are covered, and there's protection from the adversary linked to that covering. Same here, protection from the adversary. And then they also, in verse 23, Moroni actually sends people to Alma saying, we need the help of the Lord. So we want to hear what the prophets have to say about this. So they seek guidance from the prophets. They're in verse 23 as they send people to Alma. And then in, let's see, verses 24, we see that the Lamanites like to attack the weaker part of the people, is what it says. That's what the adversary seeks to do as well. He likes to find our weaknesses and then poke at them and destroy us because of them. But the Lord in Ether, he tells us, I give you weaknesses so that you and I can team up, so that you and I can be one together, and so that I can help you be strengthened in that area. I just love seeing the dichotomy here. Anyway, in verse 26, they gather together. So Moroni gathers these people together, and that they were strengthened in that. And I just find that another great principle, that we are strengthened when we gather together. Hence, seminary and institute and church meetings and temples and family nights. What a blessing. And then as they are really battling Zarahemnah, the Nephites start to win. Now look at the end of the chapter 43. We see some things happening there in verse 53 and 54. Okay. They were encircled about by the Nephites, and they were struck with terror. And now look at what Moroni does in 54. Now Moroni, so chapter 43, but verse 54. Now Moroni, when he saw their terror, commanded his men that they should stop shedding their blood. Isn't that a beautiful thing? That this righteous man, this righteous leader, Captain Moroni, when he sees their terror, he stops. He doesn't want to incite terror. That's not what he's about. Okay. And I just find that so beautiful. Now, we don't want to stop. We want to keep going in chapter 44, because in verse 41, he steps back a bit. He's like, I'm not trying to engender terror. Let's talk. And so they have this talk. He says, we're not trying to slay you. But you wanted to usurp power over us, and we can't have that. And then he says in verse 3, the Lord's delivered you into our hands. And then it's interesting that he talks about their faith. He says, we have faith in our God. We will not deny our faith. Our faith has helped to support us here by linking us to God. And then in verse 6, he says, I command you by all the desires which ye have for your life, that ye deliver up your weapons of war unto us, and we will seek not your blood, but we will spare your lives. If you will go your way and come not against us to war, come not again to war against us. Now, Zarahemnah brings his sword and everything, and sorry, I'm getting that wrong. Oh yeah, he comes forth and he says, well, you can have our weapons, but I'm not going to make this oath with you because I know I will break it. What is that teaching us about covenants? He refuses. He'll come out and he'll war against his enemy. He'll try to dominate them. He'll try to usurp power over them, but he won't break an oath. There's something about their culture and the way they look at oaths and covenants that it'd be better for him to die than to break this oath. And he won't make an oath that he knows he's going to break. Wow, that's powerful. And then in verse 11, he says, well, I can't take back the words that I have spoken. Therefore, we're going to have to fight it out. And that's when the scalp comes off and the soldiers of Moroni say, you know, you don't have much other choices. So then look in verse 14. He says, except you will deliver up your weapons of war and depart with a covenant of peace, we can't let you go. And then in verse 15, this is where we get covenant again. So they came forth and they threw down their weapons of war at the feet of Moroni and entered into a covenant of peace. And this is the thing that just blows my mind. As many as entered into a covenant, they suffered to depart into the wilderness. First of all, I love that covenant making makes you free. That's what happened here with this group of people. Too often people think if I make a covenant, it actually binds me down. But in this case, in this situation, with this writing, it says when they made a covenant, they were free to go. Our covenants and our covenant keeping actually make us free instead of be put in bondage. So of course, that also baffles me because how do you trust that your enemy isn't lying to you? How do you trust that this enemy isn't just saying, sure, I'll make a covenant with you and you let me go, and now I'm just going to sneak up behind you and stab you in the back? But again, there's something about the way they made covenants, the seriousness of covenants. And I think that can teach us so much. So then Zarahemnah is like, okay, no, I'm not going to make that covenant. But then he eventually does, and he covenants that he's not going to do it. And then look at verse 20. And Moroni caused that the work of death should cease again among the people. And he took the weapons of war from the Lamanites. And after they had entered into a covenant with him of peace, they were suffered to depart into the wilderness. There again, you've made a covenant and you're free to go. Wow, that just is amazing to me. So there's something we can learn about covenants. Do I value my covenants that way? Do I live my covenants that way? I sure hope so. But maybe there's some more I can learn there. So then we move on to chapter 45, where Helaman preaches, and then we have Alma taken up into heaven, and then some pride that starts growing in the church right there at the very end. And that's where in chapter 46 we get Amalickiah raising up. And Amalickiah wants to be king. He's gotten it into his heart that he can be king. So this is where we have Amalickiah coming out of this story. And this is where we have Captain Moroni standing up and saying, no, we are going to keep our covenants. So now let's move on to chapter 47. Okay. So in chapter 47, Amalickiah is very subtle in his plan of becoming king. And he devises this plan of how to do that, and he's going to execute the plan. He's very subtle in the way that he does this. And the adversary is too. So what happens is Amalickiah flees into the wilderness, and then he decides to stir up anger amongst the Lamanites. And he wants the Lamanites to go up to battle against the Nephites, and they won't do it. And in fact, in verse 4, it says, Amalickiah, excuse me, just a little drink water. It says, he being a very subtle man to do evil, therefore he laid a plan in his heart to dethrone the king of the Lamanites. So the adversary is subtle, so is Amalickiah. And so he decides that he's going to go talk to the Lamanite king, and the Lamanite king has given the captain of his armies the instruction that they need to go against the Nephites, and the Lamanite army won't do it. And so the Lamanite army follows Lahontai, and they go camp out in this mountain. Okay. And so Amalickiah finds out where they are, and he's going to go and send an embassy to Lahontai. And he's like, Lahontai, come down and talk to me. And Lahontai won't. And so the Amalickiah sends a message the second time and then the third time, and Lahontai won't come down from the mountain. I think that phrase is kind of interesting. In verse, it starts in verse 10, that Amalickiah wants him to come down, Lahontai won't come down. And then in verse 11, hey, come down, and he won't come down. And then verse 12, hey, come down, and he won't come down. So a fourth time, this is where Amalickiah goes up and he says, Lahontai, just bring your guys down. I want to talk to you. So Lahontai does come down in verse 13. And Amalickiah says, I want you to bring your armies down and I want you to surround us. Okay. And then we'll make this pact and you can be in charge of everything. So in verse 14, he comes down, finally does, he believes Amalickiah, and he comes down and surrounds the people, and Amalickiah is found surrounded in the morning and kind of says, okay, we'll be subject unto you, and leaves Lahontai in charge. And then Lahontai gets poisoned by degrees by the servant of Amalickiah, and Amalickiah ends up taking charge over the whole Lamanite army, right? The poison by degrees is kind of an interesting thing there in verse 19. So first he came down, then he was poisoned. Tactics of the adversary. Now, Amalickiah comes marching into the city, and he's going to go see the king. And this is where he kills the king. And then he raises the alarm. Hey, the servants of the king have killed the king. Go find them and kill them. And then he goes into the queen and wants to take charge of the city and have all the reign of the king. So this is where I think it's kind of interesting here in the story where we have the queen. Now, I want you to consider how it is written about this queen, because the queen has some power here. So we're in verse 32 of chapter 47. Now it came to pass that the queen, when she had heard that the king was slain, and then I kind of put parentheses around this next part, for Amalickiah had sent an embassy unto the queen, informing her that the king had been slain by his servants, and that he had pursued them with his army, but it was in vain, and that they had made their escape. But look at the desires of the queen here. Therefore, when the queen had received this message, she sent unto Amalickiah. Look at her desires, desiring him that he would spare the people of the city. And she also desired him that he should come in unto her, and she also desired him that he should bring witnesses with him to testify concerning the death of the king. In my female mind, I see this a little differently than some queen being duped. I think this queen had power, and I think she knew Amalickiah was up to no good. Because look at her first desire, that he would spare the people of the city. That's interesting. So when she does meet with Amalickiah, of course, Amalickiah has lied to her about what happened to the king. And it says in verse 34, and thus they satisfied the queen concerning the death of the king. Well, they satisfied what she had desired. She desired he come to talk to her, and she desired he bring people that would witness. But I don't think this queen I don't think she's just being duped. In verse 35, it says, and it came to pass that Amalickiah sought the favor of the queen and took her unto him to wife. And thus by his fraud and by his assistance of his cunning servants, he obtained the kingdom. So let's think about this. Why would a queen who has great concern about her people and who obviously thinks that something's fishy, why would she marry this guy? Well, from a female perspective, she probably thinks that by marrying him, she can still somehow protect her people. She probably feels that that's the sacrifice she needs to make to have some sort of power still to protect and preserve her people. So I find that very interesting. I'm amazed by this queen. She has that first desire to protect her people. She obviously has power to do that. And she also seems to have some sort of radar up about Amalickiah, that something's up to no good. Something doesn't sit right. And yet she chooses to sacrifice in this manner so that she can still be in a position to, in some way, affect what happens in her kingdom. So I've always appreciated that story. And while we don't have the full details about her, what she was thinking, I bet a lot of women would say that same kind of thing, that she probably made this choice consciously, not out of being deceived. Well, in chapter 48, we have Amalickiah, the Lamanite king now, seeking to overthrow Moroni and all of his people in the cause of freedom. And we have those beautiful words here in chapter 48 about covenant-keeping people. This is where we look at Moroni. And if you look at verse 16 and 17, let's see. And this was the faith of Moroni, and his heart did glory in it. So I'm in chapter 48, verse 16. Not in the shedding of blood, but in doing good and preserving his people, yea, in keeping the commandments of God, yea, in resisting iniquity. Yea, verily, verily, I say unto you, if all men had been and were and ever would be like unto Moroni, behold, the very powers of hell, I got to mark that word. I like that word, power. The very powers of hell would have been shaken forever, and the devil would never have power over the hearts of the children of men. Again, this is one of those verses where we kind of stop there and we go, wow, look at Moroni and his covenant keeping and the power that came from covenant keeping, the power over his greatest adversary, which is the devil. And then we need to recognize that there were other covenant keeping people he mentions in these next verses. Behold, he was a man like unto Ammon, the son of Mosiah, yea, even the other sons of Mosiah, and also Alma and his sons, for they were all men of God. We talked about his sons, Helaman, Shiblon, Corianton having some struggles with sin. And yet here he is mentioned as one of those covenant-keeping men that has power to shake, that has power, I'm saying this incorrectly, over the devil, that the devil doesn't have power over him. I just love that verse. And then verse 19, behold, Helaman and his brethren were no less serviceable. Okay, so what a great time to look at these men and also their wives who are such great covenant-keeping men and women. Okay. Now look at verse 23. They were sorry to take up arms against the Lamanites. They did not delight in bloodshed. They were sorry to be the means of sending so many of their brethren out of this world into an eternal world, unprepared, meaning without covenants, to meet their God. Nevertheless, they're still going to make sure that they have religious freedom as needed. So then in chapter 49, Amalickiah brings his armies again up against the weakest parts of the Nephites, and he does not succeed. I love verse 8. So chapter 49, verse 8, behold, to their utter astonishment, they were prepared for them, and this is the phrase that I'm intrigued by, in a manner which never had been known among the children of Lehi. Well, where did Moroni get the ideas then, if they were not manners which had been known amongst his people? Obviously from God. This was his inspiration. That is where he got his wonderful ideas about how to preserve his family, how to preserve liberties, how to protect the people. And isn't that what President Nelson has been saying to us? I like verse 9 where it says, they were exceedingly astonished at the manner of preparations. Like nobody had seen this before. This is totally unique. But there is safety in following inspiration. And President Nelson has said, we will not be able to survive spiritually without the guiding, protecting, comforting influence of the Holy Ghost. We will not be able to survive spiritually if we do not have an absolute way to hear him. So what a great example there. They've just done so many things to prepare not only themselves, but their homes and their cities. And in chapter 50, Moroni's guard is even up even more. So in chapter 50, we have all of these different preparations. So verses 1-6 in chapter 50, the previous things that they did to protect their families, their homes, their rights weren't enough. They knew that the adversary was going to come back and do even more. So they continue to make preparations. They continue to seek ways to stay protected. So in verse 1, he did not stop making preparations. And then in verse 1 also, they dug up heaps of earth round about their city. And then in verse 2, there's timbers that are on top of that. And then on the next verse 3, there's pickets built on the timbers. And then in verse 4, there's towers erected upon the pickets so that there would be these places of security. And then in verse 5, they were prepared so they could cast stones from the top thereof. And they're so prepared, right? It doesn't mean that they aren't going to have some disappointments and some loss. It doesn't mean that there isn't going to be some harm that does come to them, because we do know that there are battles in which they're hurt. But these things are really going to protect. But then we have someone from within that is going to cause some problems. So Moroni has made all these preparations, and then here comes Morianton, who is a Nephite, and he is having a little bit of jealousy or envy or struggle with land, and how some lands bordered and touched, and the division wasn't right, and Morianton's all upset. And so look at what happens here, because Morianton's all concerned about property, and he just stirs up this contention and anger. So Morianton, chapter 50, okay, verse 26, it says there began to be a warm contention. This is inside the Nephite lands. And then in verse 27, they want some assistance from Moroni. And then in verse 28, Morianton is very fearful of Moroni with rightful reasons. And then in verse 29, they think, well, let's just leave and we'll flee up into the land northward. And look in verse 30. This is a verse we probably don't talk about much. Behold, they would have carried this plan into effect, Morianton and his people, which would have been a cause to have been lamented. But behold, Morianton, being a man of much passion, therefore he was angry with one of his maidservants, and he fell upon her and beat her much. That's not a story we talk about. At least we don't talk about the maid. So she is beaten by her master. And that could even be a triggering subject for some of our young people, or maybe even people in our family. Yet she does not choose to stay in this harmful, hurtful situation, nor do we see her I'm trying to be delicate with my words. Resting in bitterness or anger. She chooses to do something about this. And she does something that I can't imagine how difficult it would have been. Because if you have dealt with or had personal experiences with anybody who has been, any woman who has been hit, hurt, beaten, that to talk about it is very, very hard to share it with anybody. There's not just physical hurt and mental hurt and emotional hurt, but there's other emotions that come along with it. So what she does next in these chapters is so courageous and beautiful to me. In verse 31, and it came to pass that she fled. How beautiful is that? She fled. She didn't just flee, though. Look what happens next. And came over to the camp of Moroni and told Moroni all things concerning the matter. And also the intentions that they had to flee towards the north. That would have been a hard thing to do. And I am so impressed. She is one of my heroes. Her faith, her confidence, her courage to go and do this is amazing. Not only does she flee, but she tells somebody. And not only does she tell somebody, she tells a man, which would be hard. And then I love what we have written in the text. We don't have anything in the narrative of the text of Moroni doubting her or questioning her or wondering. We have in the text Moroni acting. Moroni is going to do something about this. In these next verses, we have him getting up and going and doing something about this. And I find that to be such a powerful response. What a beautiful thing. This inspired man, not only does she know of him and feel like she can trust him. I don't even know how that, like what path that happened. How did she move from fleeing and knowing she could go and talk to Moroni? I don't know. Is this just, does she know him personally? Has she just heard of him? Where does she get her information? I don't know, but I love that that's the path that we have in the narrative, that she flees and she goes and tells Moroni all things concerning her own situation, concerning the matter, and also that Morianton's going to take the people and flee. And Moroni gets up and goes and does something. And Teancum gets involved in this too. Teancum being a mighty man. So I love that we have this opportunity to talk about a very delicate theme, but what a powerful woman. And I'm appreciative of that story. So Moroni, so Teancum slays Morianton, and then look at verse 36. And thus were the people of Morianton brought back, and upon their covenanting to keep the peace, they were restored to the land of Morianton, and a union took place between them and the people of Lehi, and they were restored to their lands. Again, this culture, their understanding of covenanting is so powerful that, okay, these people enter into a covenant saying they're not going to do it again. And boy, union is restored. They're restored to their lands. Like to say, is that shocking to you too? It's shocking to me. Maybe it's my weakness where I hold a grudge. Throughout these stories in the war chapters, when somebody covenants, I'm not going to do this again, the Nephite people embrace them, welcome them into their lands, know that they are going to keep that covenant because they said they would. And they trust them, and there's unity and peace. And I wish I had a visualization of how that works, but I need to look at that a little bit better. I need to understand it a little bit more. I need to focus on that. Am I able to do that more fully? Am I able to live my covenants that way, where people know that if I say that I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it. And I need to be able to to live with others, that when they say they're going to do it, they're going to do it. And there's such a trickiness there that I wish I could do that better. I wish I understood covenants better so that I could live in that manner where if I said I was going to do that, I was going to do it. If I say I'm never going to talk badly about you again, I never talk badly about you again. I hope I hope I live my covenants the way I should. Anyway, I know we're running out of chat time. Chapter 51, we have the kingmen raising up. They decide that they are going to take over, and that causes, again, this is an internal, that causes some problems. And then in chapter 52, we have, well, right at the end of chapter 51, we have Tiancum going in and throwing the javelin into the heart of Amalickiah. That's the end thereof. And now we have Amram, who succeeds him. And there's some battles here as well. Chapter 52, verse 10 and 11 is maybe where we could end. So here we have Tiancum, who is in Moroni, and they're trying to defend cities and take care of lands. And then we have in verse 10 and 11, it says, and Moroni also sent unto him, desiring him that he would be faithful in maintaining that quarter of the land, and that he would seek every opportunity to scourge the Lamanites in that quarter, as much as was in his power, that perhaps he might take again by stratagem or some other way those cities which had been taken out of their hands, and that he would also fortify and strengthen the cities round about, which had not fallen into the hands of the Lamanites. And he also said unto him, I would come unto you, but behold, the Lamanites are upon us in the borders of the land by the west sea, and behold, I go against them, therefore I cannot come unto you. So for me, I find this to be really interesting because Tiancum had to stand by himself. Well, like he had his armies round about him, right? But Moroni couldn't come and help at this time. And I think that's interesting that first you need to try and maintain those things that are already strong. Don't let those things that are already strong lapse, whether in your life or like here in the lands. Fortify those things. But then also stand alone if you have to. That's what Tiancum and his group had to do for a little bit. They needed to stand alone, but they chose to stand, and they were going to make that stand. So I'm just appreciative of these stories and what it teaches me about covenants, and how powerful covenant keeping is amongst this group of people. And that we should recognize how covenants play such a key in our lives, and how our covenant relationship with God is worth defending, and that religious liberty is worth defending, so that covenants can be offered to all of God's children. That covenant links us to our Savior. It covers us with his atoning sacrifice. It helps us to more fully worship our Father in heaven. And the Book of Mormon truly teaches and testifies of the covenants that will help us to be sealed up unto God through the atoning sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And I hope that as you study these chapters, you'll come up with some wonderful inspiration that the Lord will have for you about covenants also. So have a great week. Enjoy your studying and just have a great day. It's in your power to do so.